We're now going to read God's word together. So turn to Genesis 23. Genesis 23, starting at verse 1. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of this field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, Listen to me if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, were deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave were in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site.
When I was growing up, every second Christmas holidays, our family would pile into the hold in Kingswood, and we'd do a big drive across the country from Armidale, northern New South Wales, where we lived, across to Perth, where my parents came from and where all our relatives were. Now, when our family was all in the car, my dad had this habit of telling stories to match the places that we were driving through. And it wouldn't matter if we'd heard the story before. If ever we drove through that particular part of the country or past a landmark, Dad would tell the story that matched. Now, if you make the pilgrimage to Perth, as we did every second year, there's a point when you go through the West Australian goldfields where there's a big pipeline along the side of the road. Every time we drove past that pipeline, my dad would tell the story of Charles O'Connor. See, Charles O'Connor was an engineer. And back in the 1880s, there was gold rushes out in the dry, barren desert centre of WA. And with those gold rushes came this population explosion. And with the population explosion came this problem. How are we going to get water out into the desert centre where there's all these people now living? Well, Charles O'Connor was the man who was commissioned to design and build a pipeline from Perth all the way to Kalgoorlie. It was a massive project. It cost £2.5 million, which was a lot of money back then. And it involved laying down pipes which are almost 1 metre in diameter for over 500 kilometres. So it took years and years to build. Now, over those years, Charles O'Connor copped a lot of flack. People said it was an impossible project. People said it would never work. People said they were wasting money. People said it was taking too long. And over time, All of this criticism took its toll on Charles O'Connor. Eventually, he started to believe the doubters, and he gave up hope that the pipeline would ever work. And one day he rode his horse in despair, he rode his horse into the sea, and when the horse refused to keep going, Charles O'Connor shot himself. Now, it didn't matter how many times my dad told that story, I was always gripped as he told that story. And I can still remember sitting in the hold in Kingswood, driving past the pipelines through the desert, and just feeling so sad for this man who had lost hope, who had died in despair, who'd abandoned his dream. What do you do when it seems that the thing that you've put your hope into is never going to materialise? What do you do when the thing that you have been pouring your life into seems to have led to nothing? Well, for some of you here today, or watching on the live stream, today is your last principles hour. You're about to graduate. You're about to go out from SMBC to pour your lives into a dream of serving Jesus, of telling the gospel, of making disciples. What if in 1 year's time, or 5 years' time, or 20 years' time, what if you find yourself in a place where it seems like your dream is not becoming a reality? The thing that you're pouring your life into looks like it's not going to materialise. People are not responding to the gospel, the ministry doesn't seem to be going forward. What then? Well, in our story today, Abraham could easily be forgiven for feeling like this. See, it's now 62 years since God told him to leave his land and his family and his father's household and go to this place that God promised to give him. 62 years. Abraham's been waiting for God to give him this land. 62 years, Abraham's been living as a foreigner and a stranger in a foreign land. And after 62 years of waiting, Abraham still doesn't own a single square metre of this promised land. He's put his wife through so much loss and danger and risk. Both of them have poured their whole life into this promise. They've put all their hopes into this promise. But now Sarah's died. She didn't live to see the land become theirs. She's died waiting. Her time is up. And so the question in this passage that we confront as we read of her death is, what's Abraham going to do about that? Like, surely it must be tempting for him just to give up on the promise, go back to his homeland in Ur and bury Sarah there. Surely he's given it a good enough go. I mean, his 127-year-old wife has just died waiting for that promise to come true. What's Abraham going to do? Well, whatever he does, you and I need to watch carefully and learn. Because we saw last week, didn't we? In Genesis chapter 22, that after years in the school of faith, Abraham passed the end of semester exam. So the quality, the maturity of this man's faith has now been proven. So what does a mature, proven faith do in a situation like this? What does faith look like when your time is up and it seems like God's promises have failed? That's a question that we're going to bring to the text today. What does faith look like when your time is up and it seems that the promises have failed? So let's turn to Genesis chapter 23 and find out the answer. Genesis chapter 23. In the first two verses, the death of Sarah is recorded. Have a look at those verses. So Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So Sarah has died. Abraham mourns, Abraham weeps. And an important detail in these first couple of verses is the location, where Sarah dies. It says that she dies in the land of Canaan. This is the land that God, way back in Genesis 12, God told Abraham and Sarah to go to, that he promised to give to them. But what becomes apparent in the next verse, verse 3, is God still hasn't come good on this promise. Verse 3, Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and he spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead. So it's the Hittites, which are the local Canaanites. They're the local landowners. Abraham, a foreigner and stranger. And as a foreigner and stranger, he doesn't own any property. Do you think this is what Abraham imagined 62 years earlier when God told him to go and promised him this land? That he would go, that he would take his wife. 62 years later, his wife would die of old age. And not only would they not own all that land that was promised, they wouldn't even own enough to bury his wife. Do you think that's how he imagined it? Do you think he's having doubts now? Has what they lived for come to nothing? Has he uprooted his family for a pipe dream? Well, as we keep reading in this text, we discover that the answer is no. Abraham is not abandoning the dream. In fact, in the verse that we just read, in verse 4, we see an important clue as to what he's doing. He says, sell me some property. Sell me some property. And the word that's translated here as property is actually a really significant word for the author of Genesis. Back in chapter 17, verse 8, that we looked at a few weeks back, God had used that same word when he made the land promise to Abraham. Have a listen to what God said in chapter 17, verse 8. God said, the whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you. Now, the word for possession there is the same Hebrew word that Abraham's just used when he said, sell me some property. Sell me a possession, is what he's saying. You see, Abraham is pursuing the promise, possession of the promised land. And he wants this possession so he can bury his wife there. See, for Abraham and for people of Abraham's era, where you bury your family is really important. It reflects where your home is. It reflects where you belong. It reflects where you think you and your family's future lies. And for Abraham, that is the land of promise, the promised land. Now, depending on your own cultural background, what happens next you might find strange, even comical. So the Hittites say, here, have this land. And Abraham says, no, I want to pay for it. And the Hittites say, no, just take it. And back and forth it goes. And you might think, what's the big deal here? If you're not aware of the cultural subtleties that are going on, if you're not aware of what's at stake in this little negotiation, you might just think, come on, Abraham, just take their offer and bury your wife. Because for many of us, I think that reading this text here can be a bit like a cross-cultural experience. You know, those cross-cultural experiences where you don't understand the rules of communication and you miss the point. I remember when we first moved to Southeast Asia, we had a visit from a man. He came to our house, came in for a cup of tea, and it turned out in conversation that he used to work as a gardener for the people that lived in our house before we moved in. We had this nice conversation and off he went. But a week later, he turned up again, came in for another cup of tea and told me the same story, that he used to work as a gardener for the people that lived in the house before us. And I thought, yeah, you told me that last week. Anyway, we had a nice time and he left. A week later, he comes again. Comes in for a cup of tea, sits down, and he tells me the story of the fact that he used to work as a gardener for the people that lived in the house before us. So by this stage, I knew something was going on. I'm not that slow. So I went and I asked my cultural informant, what's going on? Why does this man keep telling me the same story? And the culture informant said, in our culture, telling stories is a way that we make requests. He's asking you if you will employ him as your gardener. And I said, oh, okay, I see. Okay, I'll go and tell him, no, I don't need a gardener. I said, no, don't do that. Just tell some story that shows that you don't need the gardener. When we read this interchange here between Abraham and the Hittites, we might be a bit like me in that conversation with the would-be gardener. We might be missing the point unless we understand what's going on. So let's have a look now and see what that point is. So Abraham has said in verse 4, "Sell me a possession." The Hittites' response is in verse 5. Have a look at that. The Hittites replied to Abraham, "Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." Now, this seems like a generous and polite offer, but actually it's a refusal of what Abraham's asked for. Abraham wants to own the land, but the Hittites at this stage seem reluctant to let their land go to a foreigner. So what they say is, look, just use one of our tombs. But if Abraham accepts that offer, sure, he can bury Sarah there, but the land would remain Hittite land. And so the promise would not advance. Abraham is pursuing the promise that he would possess this land. And so this offer is not acceptable to Abraham. So in verse 7, have a read. Verse 7, it says, "Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites." I don't know about you, but in my family, if I'm refusing an offer from someone, I'm saying no deal. I don't usually start by bowing down before them, but that's the polite negotiating practice that Abraham uses here. So he bows down, verse 7, and then verse 8, he said to them, "If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you." See, Abraham wants possession. He wants ownership. Abraham is pursuing the promise. He's already picked out a cave and he's willing to pay full price for it. So you see what's going on here? It's a tug of war between the Hittites and Abraham. It's a very polite tug of war, but it's a tug of war nonetheless. Let's keep going and see how the Hittites respond. In verse 10, it says, "Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. 'No, my lord,' he said, 'listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead.'" So Ephron, the cave owner, just happens to be there. And we discover in this verse here, these verses here, that all of this is taking place at the gate of the city. This is the legal centre of town. So whatever happens here in this negotiation, it's going to be legit. It's going to be legal. It's going to be binding. And so Ephron, the cave owner, actually makes a play at this point. I don't know if you noticed that. Abraham had asked for the cave. He throws in a field as well. Once again, this seems really generous, but as we'll see in a moment, it's a clever tactical move to make himself richer. But for now, notice that he uses the word give. I'll give you the land. I'll give it to you. This may well just be a polite cultural habit of courtesy. It may not be a genuine offer to just give the land. But regardless of whether it's genuine or not, Abraham cannot accept this offer. Because if everyone does give it, then the land wouldn't officially be deeded over to Abraham. It wouldn't be a formal transfer of possession. And Abraham is pursuing the promise. Abraham wants possession. So, once again, very politely, Abraham says, "No deal." Verse 12. Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, "Listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there." Once again, notice that all this is happening in their hearing. It's happening in the presence of witnesses. Whatever's going to happen here, it can't be disputed. It can't be contested. It's going to be legal and binding. So Abraham's response is clear, right? I will pay. I won't accept the gift. I will pay. I'll pay the full price. There must be no doubt that this land is coming into my possession. Abraham is pursuing the promise. In verse 14, we have Ephron's response to that. Verse 14, Ephron answered Abraham, "Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead." I love what Ephron does here. He just drops in a figure. "No big deal, Abraham. Like I said, I'm happy to give it to you, but if you must know, it's worth 400 shekels. And 400 shekels is probably about 10 times what the field is actually worth. So this is an absolutely exorbitant request from Ephron. So what's Abraham going to do? Ephron's asked a whole lot more than the land should be worth. But when Ephron makes this, when he says the land is worth, he uses the Hebrew word eretz. This is a really significant word for Israel and for Abraham. It's the word that God used back in chapter 12 when he said, "I will give you this land." And for subsequent generations of Israelites, that word came to mean the promised land. And so unknowingly, Ephron, when he said what the land is worth, he's just reminded Abraham, this is the land of promise, the land God has promised you. And as we know, Abraham is pursuing the promise. So what does Abraham do? Verse 16, Abraham agreed to Ephron's exorbitant terms, and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. In the presence of witnesses, Abraham pays. He doesn't haggle, he just counts out the silver. See, there must be no doubt whatsoever about this. There must be no chance for someone in the future to say, Abraham didn't pay full price, he haggled it down. So this is not really coming into his possession. So what Abraham does is he pays Ephron's exorbitant price. What's the outcome of all of this? Verse 17 reads like a legal contract. Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. The outcome is that Abraham owns a portion of the promised land. Formally, legally, indisputably, Abraham owns it. And so verse 20, the narrator concludes this story with, "So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site." And the Hebrew word underlying that final phrase there, in burial site, includes that word for possession. The same word that God had used when he promised the land back in chapter 15. Came to Abraham as his possession. So you see the significance of what's just happened here in this negotiation. The background is that God had promised a possession, and what Abraham has done here is Abraham has pursued that promise. Even when it seemed like God wasn't coming good on his promise, Abraham has pursued that promise. And now, in a very small way, this promise is beginning to be fulfilled. A small parcel of the promised land, almost like a deposit guaranteeing what is going to come, a small parcel has passed into Abraham's possession. So let's return to our question. What does faith look like when your time is up and it seems that the promises have failed? The answer is that faith pursues the promise. Faith doggedly, perseveringly pursues the promise. Faith lives for that promise, even when doing so seems like folly. Faith lives for that day when the promises will be fulfilled. Faith accepts that pursuing the promise might be costly. Faith is ready to count out the shekels. Faith is patient. Faith waits, even when we don't see as much of the promise fulfillment as we'd hoped, as we'd like. What does faith look like? Faith pursues the promise, even when sight screams out, no, don't do that, do something else. This promise is going nowhere. This promise is never going to be fulfilled. So at the end of this narrative, in verse 19, Abraham buries Sarah in the promised land, and we need to see that this is an act of faith. It's faith that one day God will give the whole land to his people. Well, 2 chapters later, in chapter 25, Abraham himself breathes his last. Have a look at that, chapter 25, verses 9 and 10. Where is Abraham buried? Chapter 25, verse 9. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the fields of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought for the Hittites. So a pattern is being established here. First Sarah, now Abraham, buried in that cave. The pattern is that God's people are living for the promise. They're not living for the now. They're not living for what they can just see and what they can touch. They're living for that promise. They're dying, waiting for that promise. They're dying, not giving up on the promise. They're living and dying in the hope that one day God will come good on his promise and give this land to his people, even if that day comes after their own death. See, a pattern is being established. Abraham and Sarah have laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow. And follow they do. Abraham and Sarah's son, Isaac, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, they also get buried in that cave. What about their grandson, Jacob? He dies a long way from that cave in Egypt. But have a listen to his dying words. Turn right to the back of Genesis. Genesis 49, verse 29. Jacob's dying words from Egypt. Genesis 49:29. I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There, Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There, Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. See, Abraham and Sarah have laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow, and they are following. They are being buried in that cave. They are living for that promise. They're dying, waiting for that promise. They're trusting that one day God will come good on his promise and do what he's promised to do, that he'll give the whole land to his people. God's people are living for that future day, even if it ends up coming after their own death. What about Abraham and Sarah's great-grandson, Joseph? Well, he too dies a long way from that cave. He too dies in Egypt. And have a listen to his dying words. Now, these dying words are the climax of the book of Genesis, the closing section of the whole book. Chapter 50, verse 24. Verse 24, he says, I am about to die. And then in verse 25, God will surely come to your aid. And then you must carry my bones up from this place. Don't bury me here in Egypt. God will deliver you back to the promised land. And when he does that, take my bones with you. See, Abraham and Sarah have laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow, and they are following. They're living for the promise. They're making a statement in their death, identifying with people of the promise, being laid to rest in the promised land out of a confidence that one day God will fulfill the promise. God will carry out his great missional plan. He will give the land to his people. Abraham and Sarah laid out a pattern for future generations of God's people to follow, and that includes you and me. You see, we, God's people, we are still waiting for God's promises to Abraham to be fully and finally fulfilled. We're still waiting for that moment when people from every nation will enjoy blessing in the land, in the place that God is preparing. Yes, the promise was partially fulfilled in the days of Joshua, but the full blessing to all peoples didn't happen then. And in the New Testament, we discover that that land, that place is actually the new creation, the heavenly homeland. And we discover that that moment will be the moment when Jesus returns. And so you and I, we're still waiting for that moment. And if that's what we're doing now, if we're waiting for that moment, then we need to learn to follow the pattern that Abraham and Sarah laid out for us. Living for the promise. Dying, waiting for the promise, pursuing the promise, pouring our lives, pouring our shekels, pouring our everything into that promise out of a confidence that one day God will fulfill it. And that's what the writer to the Hebrews is talking about in that famous chapter, chapter 11, that famous chapter about faith. Have a look at Hebrews 11, first couple of verses. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients, like Abraham and Sarah, were commended for. See, buying a field in the promised land, that's confidence in what we hope for. Burying your wife in the promised land, that's assurance about what we do not see. Assurance that one day God would come good on his promise. That's faith. That's the pattern you and I are to follow. In verse 9 of Hebrews 11, he writes, "By faith he," that is Abraham, "made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God." As we look back on Abraham's life and we ask, how could he do all of that? How could he live as a foreigner and a stranger in a foreign land? The answer is here. He was living for the promise. He was looking forward to that city that God would build. Verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Abraham and Sarah didn't receive what was promised. They died waiting for the full fulfillment. They lived their lives in hope, in faith, waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. And that is the pattern that you and I are to follow. See, just like Abraham and Sarah, we're waiting for the heavenly fulfillment of that promise. We're longing for a better heavenly country. And we wait, as we wait, we too live for the promise. We live pursuing the promise. We live for that moment that may well come after we've died, when Jesus returns and the promises to Abraham are completely fulfilled. Right now, we're pouring our lives into that moment, putting our hope in that moment. And living that way is very different to living by sight. See, living that way is not going to make sense to people around you who don't know the promise. Just imagine someone who didn't know the promise to Abraham, watching the negotiations between Abraham and Ephron. He might have jumped in and said, No, Abraham, don't do that. Don't waste 400 shekels on that. The land's not worth that. Don't waste all that money. Living for the promise won't make sense for people around us who don't know the promise. Some of you are finishing up at SMBC this year you're heading off into a life of serving Jesus, as you pour yourself into evangelism, into discipleship, into church planting, Bible study leading, praying, caring for people, as you pour yourselves into those things, there might be people around you who want to jump in and say, no, don't do that. Don't waste your life on that. Don't do that. You might be tempted to live for something else, something more tangible, something you can see. It's going to be especially hard if you're not seeing the progress in your ministry that you hope to be seeing, if it feels like your ministry dream is not becoming a reality. What will you do then? Well, Abraham and Sarah have laid down a pattern for us to follow. Pursue the promise. Whether we're seeing God's promises go forward in our personal ministry or not, we pursue the promise. Charles O'Connor stopped believing that his dream of the pipeline would become a reality, and he took his own life in despair. After he died, they completed the pipeline, and contrary to everyone's expectations, it worked, and the goldfields were watered. Sometimes when our dad told us that story, we'd stop at a rest area and we'd drink water from the Charles O'Connor pipelines. And I remember sitting there thinking, if only Charles O'Connor could see me now drinking this water. If only he could see me now when he was having those moments of despair and when he gave up on his dream. That would have got him through those moments. Abraham spent his life waiting for the promise. And yet when he died, what did he have to show for it? He'd been promised descendants like the grains of sand on the seashore, and he had Isaac. He'd been promised this massive land, and he had a tiny portion of the land which he'd had to pay an exorbitant price for. That was the extent of the great nation, the people of God, that he'd been promised. But if he could see us now, around the globe today, hundreds of millions of believers from hundreds of tribes and nations and peoples, if he could see us now, there may be times in the future for us when it seems like our time is up and the promises are failing. If only we could see that day now, that day when Jesus returns. If only we could see that now, that'd get us through, wouldn't it? Well, with the eyes of faith, we can see that day. And we need to fix our eyes on it. Let's live for that day. Let's pursue that promise. Let's pray. Dear God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God who is preparing a heavenly homeland for us, your people, God who is going to send Jesus for a second time to bring all of your promises to Abraham to fulfillment, we thank you. We thank you for your promises. And we ask you to help us hold on to them, whether we're seeing them fulfilled in front of our eyes or whether we're just waiting. Help us to hold on to your promises. Help us to pursue the promise. And help us to see with eyes of faith that day when Jesus returns and to live for that day, to organise our whole lives around the reality that that day is coming. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.